come to Art 8, and the title of this presentation is that Architecture, Prisms, Vision into History. This print that we're starting with was the last great artwork that Hiroshige produced at the end of his life. He died in 1858 of cholera. And this is one of the rarest of all Japanese prints that you will ever see anywhere in any museum in the world. Usually these large prints were triptychs, that is, they were three Japanese prints that were made to go together, but this print is a single sheet. And it took 3 men to position it, to print it. And each color has a separate wood block, and so they had to be laid exactly right, precisely, every time. And so there were several wood blocks and several impressions on the wood blocks. And this is the landscape that is one of the most classic in Japan. It's the Kiso Kaido, the Kiso Highway through the mountainous center of Japan. And this is a snow winter scene, and this is Hiroshige's artistic person in the spirit, where he has joined the snowy night landscape of eternity. There are 7 little figures that are on this convoluted path, the Kiso Kaido, going through this mountainous, snowy night landscape. And each one of them is single, is solitaire. Not alone, but solitaire. But the 7 figures together are held together by the invisible and yet expressed spirit of the artist who is the landscape himself now, making an 8th and making a set of all of them together, bringing them into a harmonic. We're doing something that is ancient, and even more than ancient, is almost primordial with beings of our kind. One of the most profound things that happened about 7 million years ago is that the great primates, the apes that had been around for 70 million years, about 7 million years ago, in the savannas of the Sahara Desert in northern Africa, learned that they were better equipped to forage on the ground, and they could still go into the trees, but that they could make their living better by walking on 2 feet, on 2 legs, and became bipeds rather than trusting that they were either 4-legged animals on the ground or 2 long-armed animals in the trees. They changed and became bipedal. They started walking, and as they did so, the entire evolution of the physiological system, from the bones to the muscles to the flesh to the neural systems to the glandular arrangement to the way in which the brain now had a different function, because the eyes, being upright and paired stereoptically in color to be able to see in a bipedal way, the entire evolution of man came from this action. And so one of the most primordial yogas in the world was not sitting, but walking. And walking is a special kind of a motion. And it is this walking motion that was the index of architecture in many parts of the world, especially in Japan, which interests us because it influenced not only Hiroshige, whose great artworks about walking hundreds of miles on special Zen journey highways, but influenced Frank Lloyd Wright, who were pairing with Hiroshige to understand why it is that architecture is the most major art and is the bridge that leads into science, is the phase of human development that generates a superconscious quality called historical consciousness. And we're trying to understand it from primordiality, not from ideas, because ideas come very late in the game, and they are only midway as a game, and they do not carry all the way through to reality. The basic unit of Japanese architecture is based on the step, and a human, upright, bipedal Homo sapien, after 7 million years of evolution of walking upright, generally around the planet, when they take a step, that step is about what we call 3 feet. And it's interesting because those 3 feet, each one of those feet is the length of 3 palms. And so you have a curious primordial relationship of 3 to 1, and 1 being able to be understood in terms of 3 ones, which is one of the most esoteric Zen Buddhist Vajrayana qualities in the East Asia tradition, the mystery of the 3 ones. When early Christian missionaries, the Jesuits, went into China, they talked about the Trinity, and the Chinese thought that they were traditionally wise because they thought it meant the 3 ones. And later, when they found that it was just an ideological phrase out of a rather closed mental reduction, they threw all the Jesuits out of China. They threw all the missionaries out. They said, go home. This happened in the reign of Qianlong and the Qing dynasty. The human step of 3 feet is one part of a cylinder motion where the other step restores the balance. And so while one step is 3 feet, 2 steps, a pair of steps, make a pace of 6 feet. And so the basic unit of Japanese floor space in its architecture is the tatami mat, or sometimes, because the character can be read with the pronunciation jo, but the tatami mat is 6 feet by 3 feet. And so rooms in Japanese architecture are always in terms of so many tatami mats. And they are always arranged in the sense that they are not only paired, but they have a pairedness that is in relationship to a third. So you have this rather interesting architecture of unity that has its deepest rhythm in pairedness and has its most formal stability in triads. And so you have the 1, you have the 2, and you have the 3. And the way that the tatami mats are arranged in a Japanese architecture room space is that they are positioned so that they always follow a pinwheel pattern. That the strategy is to make sure that there's a pinwheel because it reflects the triadic quality of stability in an enlarged expansion. So if you have 3 tatami mats, 2 of them would be running together, and they would have their corners that are touching in the center of a third. And so if you expand, one of the smallest rooms you could have would be a very tiny little space. Generally, there are 6 or 8 tatami mats. 6 tatami mats would make a room about 9 by 12. And they're always arranged so that they go in this pinwheel fashion, and you can have rather large spaces, but you always have the composition of the tatami mats in this range. All of what is being talked about in this way is about measure. And it is based on a sense of the human body in its scale and its proportion that is developed when it is moving. So you have a stable scale that has a generative proportional ratioing when it's put into action. And with these 2 together, one has measure. One has a sense of how to scale something, how to proportion, how to ratio. But measure is different when you bring in another quality, and that is counting. And the best way to understand the difference is that measurement is distinct from measure. Measure is all about scale and proportion of our kind and our movement, our ability to exist and be, and to bring that into life. And that's the quality of scale and proportion and measure. But measurement is a symbolic indexing based on counting, on numeracy, where one divides exactly by counting, and the general counting was always 10 digits, or a hand, 5. To count by 5, or to count by tens. And later, of course, because of the way in which there is a quality of trying to adjust measurement to measure, instead of just a 10, a 12 quality came in to try and balance between measure and measurement. And the English foot of 12 inches is this kind of a compromise between measure and measurement. The metric system is all about measurement. And this leads to the ability to have an analytic, and is the quality and character of science. So art is all about measure, about scale, stable scale, and proportionate movement, and ratioing. And one of the basic qualities in art is that because one has balance, one has equanimity in pairedness, that 2 is a set, 1/2 of which is an existential. And that the way to say that proportion is that this is not 1 so much, but it's 1 to 2, or 1/2, it's 1/2. And as soon as you have that, a mysteriousness exchanges out of nature and becomes mystical in consciousness, because consciousness now begins to understand that the oneness that it at first took to be existential is in fact only 1/2 of what is existential, and you need 2 to tango. You need a pairedness to make a existential unity. And so they rock in 2 by 2, as Chuck Berry once said. Or as Noah said, you need two of each kind to have what they are. So that the pairedness is not a two so much, but it's reestablishing the primordiality of its existence, of its oneness. The two become one flesh. That pairedness then is better talked about as a symmetry of measure rather than as something which is a two quality. And that two-ness actually is an expansion, a resonance of that primordial, reestablished, real one. And out of this comes a very distinct advance in human culture to art, and from there into history. In the ancient Far East, in China, the saying was always that man is the bridge between heaven and earth. Man, in his existence, in his heart-centered existence, his feeling-toned sentience, the word for it in ancient China, still there, is Zhen. Zhen. That Zhen is the bridge between Tao and Te. The Tao of nature, the Te of ritual action, producing events, producing objectivities. And the event and action of a karmic activity will always produce a result, which is stable, which is objective, but also which will be capable of a balance further in culture, and also of a transform by having something called visionary consciousness come into play. And so it can be modified and it can be grouped. It can be grouped back into balance. It can be modified so that the transforms operate in it so that it can eventually achieve balance. Out of this, we develop in science an extraordinary ability to be as exactingly, accurately real as anyone desires, to any degree of specificity. If this negative electric focus particle has 512 megavolts, it is an electron. But the electron also has, very interesting, it has its opposite in polarity, its pair, the positive electron, called the positron, found in 1932, Caltech. But not only the electron and the positron as a pair, every pairedness has its own pairedness. And so electrons have holes. And positrons have their mysterious pairedness as well. 21st century engineering and manufacturing makes great use out of electron holes for pacing, for articulation of structure. We can't do without it. We need those holes. Let's come back to pacing. Let's come back to walking. One of the most powerful yogis of the 20th century in India was named Vinoba Bhave. He was the successor to Mahatma Gandhi, and he was one of the most accomplished yogis of all time. When he went to Gandhi as a young man, he was about 20 years old, and Gandhi was struck by the absolute genius of the man and the spiritual vibration from the man. And he said, "You're very special. I want you to take yourself to the center of India, and wherever that is, to establish a ashram there and stay there until I call you. This was about 1921. And Vinoba said, well, what shall I do there? And Gandhi said, I want you to learn to read every language in the world so that you can read every religion in the world in its original language and to bring them together so that they can be expressed as a new harmony for man. And so Vinoba went to the center of India, which is out in the desert, in the Deccan. There was nothing there, like the Mojave Desert. And he established an ashram called Wardha. And Gandhi did not call him for 20 years. And so Vinoba learned every major language in the world: Arabic, Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, Chinese, you name it, English, all of them. And one of the most powerful things that he brought out after Gandhi was killed, was assassinated, and he didn't know what to do to carry on, he began just walking around India because he didn't know what he should do or what there was to do. And as he did, he came out with a phrase that has since become like a talisman phrase in modern yogic practice. He said, walking is the correct pace of thinking. That while you are sitting, you can meditate, and while you're standing, you can contemplate, but to think clearly, you have to walk. And somebody noted, well, isn't that what they did? Because the whole aspect of classical Greek wisdom in Plato's original school was that you would walk together around in the garden and you would have your conversation, your dialogue, while you were walking together in a landscape. And there's something about not just walking by yourself is the correct pace of thinking, but walking together so that you share a pace, so that your rhythms modulate, you can think together clearly. And any number of people can walk together and think together in this way. And one of the largest examples of this in history was in 1930 that Gandhi did, and was an insight that Vinoba remembered when he was walking around. When you walk in a yogic way to find out what there is to find out, it's called a yajna in ancient India, because the original yoga master of this was back about 2,800 years ago, and he was a great Upanishadic sage called Yajnavalkya, and he wrote the first Upanishad called the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad. Brihad is breath. Aranyaka means a forest retreat, and it means the master of the movement in the great breath forest retreat. And of course, the great breath is that one is able to speak truth precisely, and in this way, language in its poetic penetrates through the maya of the mind's rhetoric and expands that poetic so that it goes back and brings oral language into magic visionary language. And out of this now, one doesn't just tell myths, but is able to bring those myths consonant all the way into poetry. The Greek word for that process is poiesis. Creative imagination, language transform making of new forms. One now can tell myths in their flow in the natural integral, but one can modulate those myths which are real because they flow with nature. Now those myths, because they flow with vision, those myths now have an ability to emerge not just in the mind, but they emerge through the mind into art. And because art has now this kind of a inner oomph, extra step, all art forms have this as a quality of their reality. And so art forms do this with the process of consciousness, and they bring it so that it gets an extra oomph and emerges as historical consciousness. Vision becomes history. And to think that history is just simply a record is to be naive on at least 6 orders of ignorance. And that most people in the world labor under this is part of the reason why the world is as shabby as it is. It is a junkyard compared to what it will be. The whole motion of architecture is that it is not a mental, symbolic form culminating an integral ecology in just nature. That it is, like all art forms, a spirit person, high dharma transform, and part of its high dharma is that it can generate a reality process equal to nature, equal to experience, and equal to consciousness itself, equal to vision. And so history becomes the 4th phase, the 4th phase process in reality. And it makes a great diamond that one now has the ability, with the emergence of history, through art forms, through spirit person artists who make these prismatic forms of themselves, of works of art, raised especially in architecture, so that now it is capable of being scaled indefinitely. And one now has not only the fact that you are no longer just a character in your experience, a protagonist in your myths, in your stories, but now you become the storyteller. You're no longer just an individual in your mind in some sense of symbolic identity, but that you have emerged into the bright light of spiritual, artistic person. And that person can have a history. Not individually, but as their prismatic person. They have the reality of having a history, which can be shared. Easily shared with someone else so that 2 people can have a history together. And not just 2 people, but anyone who comes into or out of that sharedness, now one has an expanded historical possibility. And in the ancient way that human beings used to say, while man is the bridge between heaven and earth as an artistic person, his gen, her gen, bridges Tao and Te, when they come together and now they have a child, that family also is not a unity, but is a fundamental pivot of this larger dynamic of the spiritual form. And so while man is the bridge between heaven and earth, the family is the bridge between the individual and the larger forms of community, the village, the district, the province. And so one has this interesting kind of scalar measure that begins to become coherent. One can understand this is how things are. This is what they're for. This is how we create them. This is how we make them stable. This is how we make them dynamic. And all of it is sabotaged by the individual mind that thinks it's the be-all and end-all. Because all it can do in larger realities is to project itself willfully. Somebody once quoted a famous Hollywood film director, and I said, well, what is cooperation? And he said, where everybody does what I tell them. Now we've got cooperation. The person, then the family, then there's a third development. And that is that one now has a landscape. That district, that province, that state that extends as far as that landscape's ecological balance. And that landscape now, everyone living within that landscape, those families in that landscape have a third resonance as a larger unit of mankind. Politics calls it the state. The confederation of states as some kind of empire. But the fact is, it is not the state, it's not the empire at all. Because that landscape is expandable, and we know now, for several hundred years, that our natural landscape is the entire planet, the entire world. So that our person, as an artistic spirit prism, is related to the entire planet, because our family resonances allow for that third expansion, and the whole planet now relates to an even larger ecology called the star system. And so we move from person, whose gen pairs and balances Tao and Te, to a family whose gen balances the person as a differential jewel through the planet to the entire star system. Yeah, that's the scale we're at the early 21st century. In 200 years, the expansion will be that we will have explored and developed the star system and matured ourselves to the point that in the beginnings of the 23rd, 24th century, our whole star system will be the community that relates us to all the other star systems. In the next order of things, the galaxy. So we're now embarked for a long time on leaving behind childish things, of keeping childlike playfulness, but in consonance with a maturity that not only needs to be now, but will be. It isn't that nature abhors a vacuum at all. Nature loves vacuums. We know from quantum physics that a energy movement, sometimes used to be called 300 years ago a force, is generated out of a vacuum in apparentness. And it works in exactly this way spontaneously. What happens in architecture is that the architecture now is the art form that allows for the expansion of the differential persons and families to go in better measure to graduated resonances of the human community. And one of the greatest architects ever on the planet was Frank Lloyd Wright, because he did this on every single scale imaginable in architecture. And one of the things that keyed him to be attentive and unrelenting through 70 years of architectural practice was something that he saw when he was a young man, about 20 years old, going to school at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. They were building a very large structure. Madison is not only the university, but the state capital. And Frank Lloyd Wright, as he was walking past this quad area, I used to live on Murray Street for 5 years, that ran into this quad space. And on one side of it is the big State Historical Library, and the other the big University of Wisconsin Library, where they were building the one. Frank Lloyd Wright just happened to be walking past when the entire structure collapsed. And 60 men were killed or maimed right before his eyes. All the floors fell in. And they found later that the contractors had cheated. They'd put all kinds of garbage and refuse into the big thick columns that were supposed to hold the structure, and of course it all just would not hold. It cracked. And Wright saw that the one thing that was indelible to him was at the top corner of this structure, which was called a cornice, something that is supposed to hang over and be like one of these old traditional Renaissance architectural details, was the thing that had tipped over the entire building and crushed it. And there was the workman still hanging dead over the remains of the cornice, and his blood dripping down onto the ruins of the building. And 20-year-old Frank Lloyd Wright said he never forgot that you must build real on every level of humanity, or there is only collapse and death for us. Fortunately, we can learn to do it. That's what this is. This is a learning to be real. Let's take a break. Let's come back into an appreciation, because art is about appreciation. And our appreciation can be tuned, and it can be not just ordered, but it can be given a scale and a proportion. And one of the differential conscious techniques by which this is done is the critique. Not critical as in symbolic mind, but critiquable in terms of artistic discussion and appreciation. The critiques will have an improvable quality to refine the art if there is a flow between experience and consciousness. If the mythic horizon, that mythic phase of experience, is flowing with the visionary conscious phase, those two flows together do not produce a synergy, but they produce a ratioing. If experience flows with nature, it produces a synergy. If our experience, our language, our images, our feeling flow naturally, the synergy is noticeable because the way in which thought comes out of that orders itself stably, becomes very clear. And the classic mythological way to talk about it in mythic imagery is that the sediment carried in the turmoil of worldly experience settles to the bottom, leaving the clear water flow. A more realistic way of looking at it is that when you are out in nature, in a landscape wilderness, if there's any pollution that goes into a stream, if that stream is running over rock and gravel in about a quarter of a mile down, you can drink out of that stream and it will be naturally purified. The flow of natural water over the natural rock and gravel and stones of the landscape purifies itself. A very short while. But experience, when it flows with nature, making a synergy, is because they are both integral. And we would not be able to characterize this without our education, without the phase form of our learning. And you see the utility now that one begins to have a way to measure all learning in a new way. Whereas the old way was by an imposed order of the mind, which first of all was only half the story, it's only an integral. And second of all, is capable of not understanding that it has abstracted itself out of the natural flow and has therefore forbid experience of having a synergy with nature as a flow. And the mind then mistakes ritual action as what nature must be. And so the mind orders ritual actions, thinking that by this way it cements together its stability of having forms. And the old way in Greek philosophy was if you understood an argument given in this way, you would clench your fist. Got it. Because the origins of symbolic written language were palm-sized originally. The first written languages in the world were cuneiform. They're about 6,000 years ago, and the clay used for the little cuneiform tablets were palm-sized, held in your hand. And you would literally inscribe it with the cuneiform wedges, a reed quill, and so the symbolic mind, which forms itself stably, integrally on written language, thinks in its abstractedness that this is the be-all and end-all. And since it understands that it has put order and has reinforced it by arranging the rituals, by codes, by laws, by rules that cannot be broken, that then everything should be well ordered. And of course, this is the model by which one builds prisons. And so the warden mind, abstracted from nature, is also abstracted from the experience source of itself, so that it is never going to be healthy. It will never be healthy if left to itself. And so it has to be helped. And consciousness, being a form, cannot in its own phase really help. It can give a vision to someone, they can share that vision with others, but it doesn't have the formal stability to be able to do something about it, and that's where art comes in, because art is a form that can really do something. And the most powerful art form of really doing something is architecture. Architecture is enormously powerful. Here's a little phrase from Frank Lloyd Wright. He was having a tough time in his life in the 1930s, late 1920s and early 1930s, and there were no commissions. Almost nothing was happening. He had meantime become the most famous architect in the world, in Europe and in the United States. They thought he was a has-been. He used to build houses in the 1890s in Chicago someplace, and who wanted to hear about him? So he was invited by some friends to give a series of con lectures at Princeton University in 1930. Frank Lloyd Wright was 63 years old at the time. And he gave 6 lectures at Princeton. And they have since become a collector's item, published in 1931 by Princeton Architectural Press. This is the first edition, very expensive. The end papers have all kinds of wisdom sayings by Frank Lloyd Wright. And in his beautiful presentation, in the first of the lectures, it was called Machinery, Materials, and Men. And he had a paragraph to this extent. And the paragraph preceded a reprint of something that he had delivered 27 years before in Chicago. In 1903, when he was still at the top of the heap, the most famous architect in Chicago at that time, his prairie houses were the showcase houses of the tasteful, wealthy, and the most powerful, dynamic city in the world at the time. Chicago at that time was much more dynamic than New York or London or Paris or any place. Chicago at that time was called the city of the big shoulders, because all of the railroads in America hubbed on places like Kansas City and St. Louis, but especially hubbed on Chicago. And so Chicago became the industrial might of America at its early industrial peak, and because of this, the city of Chicago became a very rough place, as well as pockets of cultivated people. There was a lot of brutality in Chicago. Out of that era came the organized brutality of the gangs, like Al Capone and the Mafia. But in 1903, the most dynamic social revolutionary in Chicago was a woman named Jane Addams. And she set up an organization in a home. She called it Hull House, and she got a lot of wealthy people to donate the money, and she put it to work, and she would take people off the street, and she would re-foster them, remother them, recondition them to get back to being human beings. And Jane Addams became the conscience of Chicago. And in order to show that this was not like just street-level goody two-shoes stuff, she would bring the best, brightest people in Chicago to deliver the best, brightest lectures that they could. And so she had the high and low of life in Chicago all in one place. And in 1903, she invited Frank Lloyd Wright, longtime friend of hers, to give a lecture. And he did, and he called it The Art and Craft of the Machine. And when he gave the Princeton series in 1930, he reprinted The Art and Craft of the Machine from 1903, but gave it a new setting for 1930, because by that time the Depression had showed that the whole industrial might of America had broken down because of a massive ingrown selfishness and greed. It wasn't just the stock market crash. It was the crash of the entire social ethos of America. And what better place than in the Hull House in Chicago of bringing that back to one of the great new intellectual centers of the New World, Princeton University. Princeton at this time was revving itself up to become one of the great scientific intellectual centers in the world. And in the 1930s, it became the top place in the world, and some of the institutes, the Institute of Advanced Studies at Princeton in the late 30s and 1940s, was the intellectual center of the planet. Einstein went there. Many other cognate people went there. Wright said, "In order that we may not foregather here in this dignified atmosphere of Princeton without due respect to authority, we will go back for our text on this, our first afternoon together. You want authority? I will give you authority. Let's talk about architectural authority." And so he says, "Go so far back that we need fear no contradiction." So he went back to one of the early greatest builders in world history. Go without hesitation to Ramses the Great, to find that all great architecture, Ramses might have used the hieroglyph for art instead of the one for architecture. All great architecture is true to its architect's immediate present. And seal it with the regal symbol. And in this connection comes the title of our discourse, The Machinery, Materials, and Men of Our Immediate Present. For those who do not know, Ramses was one of the greatest builders in human history. Ramses II ruled for 2/3 of a century, and he almost single-handedly rebuilt the monumental structures of Egypt. He outdid the Old Kingdom. The numbers of projects that he did are just scores and scores and scores, and almost all of the really important imperial stamp of power in the world come from his era. Ramesses had a little problem during his reign. There was an orphan named Moses who challenged him. Frank Lloyd Wright, in The Art and Craft of the Machine, and it's reprinted in our text, Frank Lloyd Wright, Writings and Buildings. And there are many editions of this, and it's still out. He says, "No one, I hope, has come here tonight for a sociological prescription for the cure of evils peculiar to this machine age. For I come to you as an architect to say my word for the right use upon such new materials as we have and our great substitute for tools, machines." In other words, we're not going to fear machines, but we're going to work them in as tools to help us to refine materials which are now going to be used as a transform nature. We have materials that were not there when Ramses was building, or the Greeks were building, or the Romans were building, or the Goths were building. We now have steel and special strong glass and new materials that are coming out, ceramics, and we need to make them artistic, and new machines that are coming out, that will be coming out. They must be incorporated so that they are a part of the way in which we are artistically personable. They're going to be a part of an enlarged, expanded repertoire, not of our individuality, but of our artistic person. Because art is the last phase in that square of attention, in that referential gestalt, where cultural experience is still a viable dominant. Because as soon as artistic persons capable of their own autobiographical history begin to do this, then the whole normal chronological record of things of the laws and codes and wars and this sort of thing transforms, and you get personal history, personal historical consciousness, or communities generating very large historical consciousnesses. And now we have an entire planet that can, as not as a unity, but as a range of possibility, generate a whole star system, historical consciousness. There are several thousand people earning their living now analyzing material from the Cassini scouting yajna of the Saturn system 1 billion miles away. And this is only the beginning. As this century goes on, the entire star system is going to be filled with millions of people earning their living on this kind of a scale. Wright, in his University of Wisconsin trauma, when he saw that building collapse and those dead people, just about that time was published an English translation of a French work. And it is on architecture, lectures on architecture translated from the French of Eugene Emmanuel Viollet-le-Duc. And it was published in American translation in 1889, and one of his aunts gave him a copy. And the 2-volume set of 20 lectures is reprinted by Grove Press. This is a first edition cloth Grove Press. The Duc was magnificent in putting his finger in a great transform of the time, of the European Enlightenment being transformed by the Romantic Revolution, of geniuses who wanted to not just change a few things, but to change everything. Let's change the nature of man. The French Revolution said, we're through with the calendars of the past, this is the year 1. We're not starting over, but we're starting new, fresh, and we're not taking anything from the past. But eventually, it was understood that one needs to take the good things from the past in the transform, because you get a nourished enrichment. And as you do, you begin to see that what has hindered, especially, is that there has been a melodramatic idiocy in so-called building and construction and very little architecture. He writes in English translation, this is over 100 years ago. Frank Lloyd Wright would have read this almost 140 years ago as a young man. It is especially important to note that art in this primitive form acts much more strongly upon men in their primitive state than on men highly civilized. The latter will reason. Your voice may be expressive, your accent pathetic, your gestures true and forcible, but in spite of the art you have employed in your modulation and manner, they will say, whence has he got this very unlikely piece of news? From modulation to melody, the way is short, and forthwith music is born. Let us now take architecture, which we have placed second in the rank of age. Music first, then architecture. Building a hut with branches of trees is not art. It is merely supplying of a material want. But to hollow out a dwelling in a declivity of soft rock, to divide the excavation into compartments of different sizes, according to the number and habits of the occupants, to leave pillars for the support of the ceiling, to enlarge them at the top for the greater security of the suspended mass above, then gradually cover these walls and pillars left in the solid with gravings and signs intended to commemorate an event such as the birth of a child, the death of a father or a wife, or a victory gained over an enemy. This is art. More need not be said to make it clear that music and its derivatives, poetry and drama, with architecture, are the only arts in which primitive man accentuated by the desire of propagating his ideas, preserving his remembrances, or imparting his hopes, by associating them with a form or a sound, displayed certain creative faculties inherent in his nature. A man of greater intelligence and strength than his neighbors has killed a lion. So he hangs this skin as a commemoration to perpetuate. To all who see this image, it plainly says, here's the dwelling of this man who knows how to defend himself and his own. This is art. Here it exists entire, complete, needing only to perfect its means of execution. The romantic hero who goes out on his quest not to get something, but to receive a vision, to bring back and enter that visionary transform, so that what is possible now is something that was not mythically possible, but is now historically possible. One can go to the root source of the problem. Not just triumph over the problem that was the challenge, but to go all the way back and to change the source so that that problem never occurs again, ever. One of the classic early medieval epics was Beowulf, written about 735 AD, supposedly in the middle of the Dark Ages, but written by someone who culminated, we don't know his name, but someone who culminated the ancient wisdom in a very profound way. Beowulf must kill an ogre named Grendel, who's been breaking into the big hall and killing men and eating them. And so Beowulf is a very powerful king, a very brave warrior, finds a way in his courage and his epic mythical strength to kill the monster. But the monster has a mother who is even more severe than Grendel. And she terrorizes not just the hall, but the entire land. Everyone will pay for the death of my son. So the monster's mother is the source of not only the monster, but of a huge miasma of problems that the entire land is now suffering from. Now you have to deal with his mother. You have to deal with the source of this, the source of monsters. And it's only after 50 years of maturity that the old Beowulf knows how to deal with the mother and saves the land and returns it back to health. One of the great essays by J.R.R. Tolkien is called Beowulf, The Myth and the Monsters. And you can find it in collected essays of Tolkien. Frank Lloyd Wright was like a Beowulf. When he was younger, he attacked the problem of the artificial home that encouraged the artificial individuality to egotistically think that it was powerful, it was rich, it had arrived, it should lord it over others, and to open the homes of such people so that architecturally they fanned out more and more to open the transformation of the individual ego into the array of the personably appreciative community, affine human being. He once said, it can be succinctly said, if houses are boxes, the people who live in those boxes will be just things in boxes. They will not know anything else of someone else except that they're something not yet in their box. And if they build bigger, better boxes, they can put all of them in those containers and then they will behave. He said, I set out to destroy the box as a symbol of the house, to open up its sides, to take out the corners that give it stability, to open up its roof, to set it in a landscape, and to change all of the materials so that the house now, instead of being a box, is, he called it a continuity. That the continuity is that every material in that whole architecture flows in such a way that it flows through a cycle that makes, just like the tatami mats in their spiral, it makes as one flows through that, it purifies you of your egotism, of your boxitis, of your phony authority, of your need to organize others according to superior plans for entrapment. That all this can be purified out. And what comes out is not only a person, instead of an egotistic identity in search of dominance, but families and communities that are appreciative of each other, who use critiques to refine and improve, not to accuse, who are able to engender historical consciousness instead of being thrown back into little mythic skits, little routines of karma that we knew only too well even at the time of the Buddha 2,500 years ago. What is profound is that those routines are extraneous. They have no meaning whatsoever in the cosmos. When they vanish, they do not leave a trace. There's no gaping hole. There's no darker place in between the stars, because that tyranny is gone, that authority is gone, that egotistic power, organization is gone. It leaves no trace whatsoever. There's not a single photon or gamma ray that's out of place. And so to pursue extraneousness is a sign of madness. And to live then with this kind of madness produces an insane junkyard, which most of the world is at this current time. It is not only intolerable, it is unnecessary, which makes it stupid more than even wrong. It makes it absurd even more than evil. And one of the ways in which this comes into its healthfulness, its healingness, is that architecture, in its high prismatic artistic function, is able to bring experience in its weave with vision, not its synergy. Experience has a synergy with nature. They're both integral processes. But vision is an other movement that weaves with experience, and so you get like a fabric of process rather than a synergy. You get a field phenomena rather than a synergy. And the field of experience and vision weaving together, that field is the source of a very interesting kind of tunability that the mind and its symbols are now at home in the person and their architecture. And that this architecture is not only capable of a measure, of a pace, of a scale, of a proportion, of ratios, but that measure is also capable now of engendering a further historical consciousness that allows the development and emergence of measurements, of analytical skills of science, so that one can know exactly and precisely what you are doing And so now the mind faces something that experience faces when history comes into play. That ritual had to face when art comes into play. That nature already accepted when vision came into play. Mother Nature, I used to call her Ma Prakriti about 35 years ago when I was using Sanskrit terms a lot. When Ma Prakriti sees that visionary consciousness is now in play, she says gracefully, "Good, you come and participate. You take my place." The Tao now becomes magical instead of just natural. It transforms. And so existence, in its ritual forms of action, has to learn that it has to transform as well and let art come into play. And just so mythic experience has to transform and let historical consciousness come into play. And finally, when science comes into play, the symbolic mind has to gracefully give its place over to the cosmos, to the cosmic objectivity of reality. And one then, the saying in Zen is that one is a selfless person. The person is still there in play. The differential person prismatically is very much in play as a creative form, but the symbolic mind has had to give its place over in the square of attention. This is impossible unless one is learned and learned in this very special way. It is not apparent to the mind that this is real, that this is necessary. It's not apparent to any groups of people, any networks or arrangements of people. It is never apparent. It is never reasonable in terms of what the mind is capable of doing. And so it has to learn an ultimate humility. It is not the arbiter of everything because it in itself cannot purely measure, create measure, nor can it develop measurement. The cosmos develops measurement. And without the indexing differential arrays of the cosmos, we would never know what measurement is. We would never know that an atomic clock of cesium atoms is much more accurate than some kind of sun shadow gnomon. What time in the universe is it anyway? And so the ability for the symbolic mind finally to learn humility is one of the great tasks that first is formable in art. And so architecture is one of the first places, one of the first forms in the world where one, for the very first time, is able to see in a stable, measured way, capable of being expanded and raised and refined to a measured way of formal science, that now we know not only what we are actually doing in a ritual way, or what we are experiencing in a mythic way, or how we're putting it all together in a symbolic thought way. But now we have a flow of consciousness that's going to flow with historical consciousness, prismed by spiritual persons and works of art. And this will allow for the weaving motion of vision and experience to give over to a very high transform where consciousness now flows with historical consciousness, just like experience flowed with nature. And when those two flow together, because of the way in which they have engendered, those two flows weave a very different kind of dimensional process together. Many, many dimensions. Many dimensions. It's out of that 10 or 11 dimensional field that one is able to have things like string theory or superstring theory, or even advances beyond that, which are coming in just now. All of this architecture is able to do, and has for a long time not been the arbiter, but has been the prism by which we have done this. There's a great deal of difference of going into a big natural cave system. When I was a boy, I remember being taken at about 8 years of age to Carlsbad Caverns. And the immense enormity of the way in which nature on this scale underground is magnificent. And yet, there are some caves like Lascaux that 19,000 years ago were made into an architecture where it isn't just the cave, but now it's a work of art in an architecture that served as a prism to bring Paleolithic men and women out of their just hunting the animals to stay alive to being able to understand that the animals were spirit resonances of themselves, and a whole new scale of humanity and historical consciousness came into being and into place there. It isn't just a sentimental respect for the animals and the plants and the minerals and each other, but a deeper realization that our reality is livingly embedded in this whole complex landscape called an ecology, and that ecology is embedded in more dimensions than time and space have for themselves. And out of this comes a new sense, not just of maturity, but of grandeur. Not just of health, but of radiance. New pair next week. We're going to see the greatest Chinese painter of the 20th century, Qi Shi, and the greatest sculptor since Michelangelo, Henry Moore, next week.